Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 310 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm your host, Danièle Cybulskie. In the dark forests of the medieval world, and the modern stories we tell about it, lurks a powerful, beautiful predator. Sometimes big and bad, sometimes a figure of admiration, the medieval wolf was such a big part of early English culture that it found its way not just into stories, but into the language itself. This week, I spoke with Dr. Elizabeth Marshall about wolves in Old English. Elizabeth is an independent scholar and the author of Wolves in Beowulf and other Old English texts, and the forthcoming Wolfland, The Lost Wolves of Landscape and Lore, as well as various academic and public articles on wolves. Our conversation on where we find wolves in medieval sources, how early English writers saw them, and how wolves both add to and steal language itself is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us to talk about wolves and Old English. These are both super interesting topics, so it's great to have you here to talk about both. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I have to ask you, when we're looking at wolves in early England, how do we find out anything about them, like where they are, what they're doing? How do we find this stuff out?
So the majority of what we know about wolves comes kind of filtered through the human lens, through the cultural artifacts that survive. So primarily literature, some art, some stonework. There's also kind of hints of more real wolves in the landscape in place names. There's a really great study about looking at all of the different wolf place names throughout England and Scotland and Wales as well. And it shows you both the types of landscapes that wolves are kind of associated in these toponyms, but also where the populations are kind of concentrated, assuming that places are named for wolves because they have kind of an abundance of wolves. So this kind of leads to a theory that by 1066, because there's much fewer wolf place names in the south, this suggests that wolves have started to move further northwards because they're being persecuted, the habitat is not suitable for them anymore. So they're moving further and further north towards less populated areas and areas that they are more sheltered from people. There is some archaeological evidence. You get things like wolf teeth showing up as grave goods in early graves. But generally speaking, we don't tend to have very many archaeological records at all, largely because wolves weren't considered a very useful animal. Their fur is kind of considered not great in comparison to the fur of things like stoats or ermine, these really kind of rich, luxurious furs. There's some evidence of a modest trade in wolf furs, but they're generally considered smelly and not really worth having. They're not eaten. It's considered a taboo to eat wolves from a Christian perspective because they might have eaten a human. There's this perception that they might have taken in the flesh of a human, and then it kind of becomes this issue of cannibalism almost if the person eats wolf flesh. So that's this taboo. And their body parts do show up in more medicinal or kind of magico-medicinal contexts. But generally speaking, they're not really considered a very useful animal. So if they're being hunted or being trapped, it's primarily to get rid of them because they're a threat to sheep and other livestock.
We were talking briefly about habitat just now. Where are these wolves living? Because when we picture the UK today, there aren't that many forests, like deep forests, but this is a different landscape back in the day, right?
Yeah, so there is a perception that medieval England, particularly what we think of as Dark Age England, which is a whole problem in itself. Mm-hmm. But there's this idea that Dark Age England is a place where a peasant will be travelling through a very deep forest and they might be set upon by wolves or thieves or robbers or what have you. But actually, woodland has very slowly but surely been in decline for a very, very long time, well beyond the beginning of the Middle Ages, much further back. So although we do have a lot less woodland today, it's been a gradual movement towards that point rather than a more sudden departure, as it were. there's this kind of association between wolves and wilderness. I think it's one that we have today. It's a very fairy tale kind of gothic image that we have of wolves stalking through woodland, hunting little girls in red cloaks. But actually, they're not primarily confined to woodlands, particularly because woodland isn't this kind of wilderness area that we tend to think of it as. It's a landscape that is exploited quite heavily for all the resources that it produces. So you do get wolves, or there's theory that wolves are living in the more dense areas of forests, but they're certainly not confined to those landscapes. So you might find them in more upland, mountainous areas, or the fens are another place where it's considered a good habitat for wolves because it's got abundant wildlife that they can prey on. Maybe not the kind of wildlife that we tend to think of them eating, like deer, but, you know, they can survive on fish, they can survive on birds, marine life. They do very, very well in those areas. The only things that wolves need to survive are prey and shelter, and ideally not persecution from humans. And that's why the fens are a really good place for them, because fens are very difficult for people to traverse, especially before areas of them have been reclaimed and drained so that they can be built on. So yeah, it's thought that fens were a fruitful place for wolves to be, and that's also reflected in the place name evidence as well. There's hints of places that are kind of marshy, swampy areas being associated with wolves, particularly in East Anglia, which has a very rich wolf tradition, and it's possibly because East Anglia is an area of England that has lots of fenland.
Well, I wanted to get into this because I think that you're right. People imagine that you're always wandering in a wood and you're going to be set upon by wolves and it's going to be very scary. I mean, Canada's much bigger than the UK, but you almost never see wolves out in the wilderness. They just disappear. They melt into the landscape really, really quickly. But you did find a charm, which I thought was interesting, because this is going to be a rare occurrence that you'd see one at all. There is a charm that you found that involved, like, if you have the hair of some wolves with you, then you're going to be okay. They're not going to attack you in the woods. And I was thinking, like, this is an unlikely event, but maybe it's like flying on airplanes, right? It's unlikely, but people still do superstitious things to keep them safe on an airplane, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's one of those things where even today, from, you know, when we live in an age where we're very cognizant of the fact that wolves actually pose very, very little danger to us. But I think it's very rare to come across a person who doesn't have kind of a little inkling of fear of wolves just in the back of their mind. I think it's kind of the same in early medieval England. You know, there's a chance that you'll come across a wolf, sure, but they're almost certainly going to run away from you before you even know that they were there. They have an incredible sense of smell. So if humans are coming into their territory, most likely they're going to be vacating that territory ASAP because they don't want anything to do with humans. So yeah, I think things like the charm are, like you say, kind of like a just in case thing.
Well, I think that maybe one of the things that you're getting at here is that when people think they're going to come across a wolf, they're not necessarily afraid they're going to be eaten, but they might be afraid that their speech is going to be taken from them. So tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, this was something I was very surprised to learn about when I was doing the research for the book. So there's this superstition. It begins in the classical world. There's some evidence that Plato might have known about it, but certainly it's known by Virgil, it's known by Theocritus, a Greek poet, it's known by Pliny, it's known by Ambrose, it's known by Isidore. It kind of travels all the way through the classical period until it gets down to early medieval Europe and to England specifically. So there's this superstition that if a wolf sees you before you see the wolf, and I always get that mixed up. It's a very difficult sentence to say. If a wolf sees you before you see the wolf, you'll lose your speech. You'll be struck dumb.
Well, it's interesting and something that you get at in the book, where I feel like when we see one, it's so spectacular. And as you say, they kind of make the hairs stand up on the back of your neck. When we see one, we are struck dumb because this is something that you have to sort of look at and think about. Am I in danger? But also they're so beautiful that you are struck dumb. But this is interesting, whereas if the wolf sees you first, then you might not be able to speak. It is very interesting. And it leads to a little phrase that people throw around in their speech sometimes, which is the wolf in the story. And I love this. So when do people say the wolf in the story?
So the wolf in the story it's a saying that's kind of idiomatically equivalent to how we use the phrase speak of the devil. So if you're talking about somebody and maybe you're not necessarily saying something very nice about a person and they come into the room, you stop talking, right? Your speech has been stolen by the appearance of that person. So that person becomes like the wolf in the story. They're the wolf in the story that you have just been talking about. They are the subject of your conversation and you abruptly stop talking when they come in. So yeah, very similar to the way we say speak of the devil now.
I love that. And I would love to bring that back, but I think it will be like just among the people who have read your book, have listened to this podcast, but we can start to make this catch on, right? Sure.
Yeah. Well, I think in French, they do still use wolf rather than devil in that phrase. So I think there are some other languages as well. I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, it's something that's died out in English, but I think there's scope for bringing it back based on the fact that it's survived in these other languages as well.
Yeah, let's start that. Well, you were talking about the devil, so let's go there for a minute. The wolf is often associated with the devil, I think probably for reasons that might be obvious to us, but tell us why the wolf is associated with the devil.
It stems back to the New Testament of the Bible, and it's considered to be based in the reality of the people who are writing down the New Testament, in that they are a pastoral society and they are kind of living in fear of their livestock, which are obviously very important to their livelihood, of their livestock being eaten, taken or slaughtered by wolves. So that becomes a very fruitful metaphor in the New Testament for the devil who is preying on human souls, and particularly in the context of Christians being metaphorized as sheep and Christ being the Lamb of God. Yeah, very, very fruitful metaphor, and one that I think has an immediacy, particularly in the early medieval world, when sheep farming is so and becoming ever more important to the medieval economy. It's a very real and visceral image that probably contributed to people's ideas of what the devil was and what the devil was capable of doing. Because if you saw a sheep that had been slaughtered by a wolf, you might make the connection of that's what the devil will do to my soul if I don't stay faithful to Christ and to God.
Well, I think that one of the key parts of this, I mean, there's the violence of it, the suddenness, but also the stealth, which is something that I think we'll get to when we get to more about language and wolves. But when it comes to this being the devil, this is a sneaky attack that you don't see coming. You may not see until after, when it's carnage. And I think that is an aspect of wolves that maybe is a bit different than when we think about other predators in nature. Something that is sort of associated is their sneakiness, their stealth, perhaps more stealth than I'm thinking about, like, what's the difference between wolves and foxes? And it's like more stealth when it comes to wolves, I think, than slyness, which is more fox-like. Would you say that is a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's true. And you've reminded me of some manuscript images. Quite a common image is a wolf looking very kind of low to the ground, stealthily stalking towards a pen of sheep that look a bit terrified. The other interesting thing about the way wolves operate is that they sometimes do what is known as surplus killing. I don't know if it's a behavior that is unique to wolves, but it's certainly one that wolves are well known for, in that they will, if they find a source of prey that is both abundant and ripe for the taking, it could be a herd of deer that are trapped in heavy snow, or it could be a flock of sheep that have nowhere to go to escape from, they will just kill all of those animals. And people kind of take that as evidence for the wolf's bloodthirstiness and their kind of thirst for violence and their inability to stop themselves from slaughtering everything that they see. But it's actually just one of those very natural behaviors, right? It's an animal that is programmed to kill because they're actually very unsuccessful at hunting, which I always think is quite funny. Wolf hunts, I think, less than 20%, maybe even less than 10% of the time are actually successful, because there's loads of different factors. You know, deer can outrun them, or deer can stand their ground. They can seriously injure wolves with their legs or their antlers. So when wolves are presented with this opportunity, lots and lots of prey that are, like I say, ripe for the taking, they will take them, but they will come back to that food source. They'll bury some parts to eat them later, or they'll keep returning to the kill site over and over. So yeah, I think there is that element of stealthiness for sure. And that's, again, one of those things that is very good for a metaphorical devil connection, right? Because the devil is sneaky and comes at you when you're least expecting it. If your faith wavers even a little bit, the devil can sneak right in there to prey on your soul. But yeah, there's also this element of just carnage, I think, that wolves are associated with. And it's kind of an unfortunate thing that it is based in reality, but it's morphed into this thing that is an excuse for people to persecute wolves a lot of the time because they think of them as such a bloodthirsty and vicious animal.
Well, I mean, it's a little bit unfair because if this was any other creature, they would say this is efficient and it's stockpiling for later. And that's very smart. But when it comes to wolves, because it is a violent event, then they get the short end of the stick. So the one more thing I want to talk about, we're talking about sort of wolves in their natural habitat, doing what comes naturally to them. Often when I was going through your book and other places I've spotted wolves in medieval texts, they're often by themselves. And this is really not how they live. So is that something that you've noticed as well? They're not really often talked about as a pack. What do you see when you're looking at wolves?
Yeah, I think that is true. In almost all of the early medieval literature that I can think of, yeah, you're absolutely right. They're always lone wolves. It's just occurred to me now, I wonder if that's based in a lived reality, in that you only really get lone wolves so a wolf pack is a family. So you have the male and the female, they breed, they have a litter of pups. Sometimes the pups will stay with the pack, and other times when they get to about a year old, they will disperse from the pack and become a lone wolf in search of another lone wolf to mate with and start their own pack. And because those kinds of wolves are moving through the landscape a lot, I wonder if people are encountering them more frequently because of that. I also think it's potentially because of another association of wolves kind of across early medieval Europe, not just in England, but they're associated with outlaws. And outlaws are these people who are bereft of community. They are people who have committed some kind of a crime, done something wrong. They've kind of acted in an animalistic way, and therefore they are cast out of the community to go and live in the woods, kind of stereotypically as an outcast, as a wolfish person who has been excommunicated in a way. Probably that association is responsible for the fact that lone wolves often appear much more frequently than packs do, despite the fact that the reality is that wolves live in packs. They need the pack to survive.
Well, and I think perhaps one of the other lived experiences is if you're going to see one, you usually only see one. From what we know today, you usually see only one and not the whole pack. And so maybe this is lived experience as well. But the one, I do want to come back to outlaws because this is so important. But the one other place where people tend to regularly see wolves, they say, is on the battlefield. So tell us about wolves' association with battle, because one of the scholars in your book, I think it's Mohammed Eric Rahman Lacy, suggests that wolves actually may have learned to associate armed men with food, which is such a big statement. It's like Pavlovian. So tell us about wolves and battle.
Yeah, so this is probably one of the most well-studied types of wolf in Old English literature. They often appear in the context of poems about battle, and they'll either appear before a battle has begun as kind of a herald of doom almost, as in they are waiting for the bloodshed and the slaughter so that they can take advantage of this glut of corpses that is going to result from this battle, or they will appear at the end of the battle to take advantage. So this is what's called the beast of battle topos. It occurs in lots and lots of Old English, but also Old Norse and Old Welsh poems. So it's a very common association. And they also often appear with two other beasts of battle, which is the raven and the eagle. So if you see a raven and a wolf together in a poem, sometimes you get combinations of the different animals. But if you see one of those combinations of animals together, hinting at that same association, that there's going to be bloodshed and these scavenging animals are going to appear to take advantage of that. And yeah, I think it's really interesting that that is quite possibly based in this reality of what people experience. And it's something that still did happen in some places after the bloodshed of battles of World War II. It's certainly something that they do. And again, I think it's something that fills us as humans with this visceral horror. But at the end of the day, it is kind of a natural behavior for them. If there's easy prey, they aren't going to distinguish between a human or a deer or a bear cub or any number of animals. I love this idea that they see these armies on the move and they make that association. They think, I'm going to follow them because that's where the food is going to be. It's also interesting in terms of that connection with ravens, because there seems to be, even today, a kind of symbiotic relationship between wolves and ravens. So wolves will follow ravens, or it's kind of theorized that they will follow ravens because ravens will lead them to potential prey, whether that's a wounded deer or something like that, so that they can take the animal down and then the ravens will come in and feast with the wolves. I do think it did happen, but probably I would imagine kind of took on a life of its own because it is such a visceral, gory image. And also I think it's a really effective way, poetic way of signaling that something big is about to happen. You know, the wolves start howling and the ravens start circling and the eagles start screeching, and you know it's a way to build up that anticipation. And then equally at the end of the battle, it's a way to kind of show how much bloodshed there has been, and whether that is to glorify the victors of the battle or whether it's to commiserate that they have lost so many men if they are the losers of the battle.
Yes, and it makes complete sense for this to work in tandem with these images of it being like the devil as well, because when there's death, there's someone coming over to steal your soul. So these associations, I think, are so important. So I did not want to leave them behind. So we have associations of wolves being things that live in the forest. They're savage, maybe devil-like, they're sneaky. So then we see wolves appearing in Old English as a language. So where do we see wolves appearing within the language?
There's one word for wolf in Old English, which is wolf, but with a U rather than an O. So very, very simple. What's more complicated is the fact that there is a word for outcasts, wearg, which might sound familiar because it's the word that Tolkien borrowed from for his wargs that the orcs ride in Lord of the Rings. And it's a very complicated issue because there's an Old Norse cognate, varga, which did mean both outcast and wolf. But there's no solid evidence from the corpus of Old English literature that the Old English word wearg did mean both. But having said that, there are instances where maybe a wolf-like creature is called a wearg, or the word is kind of used to describe a person who is a kind of wolfish outcast or somebody who behaves wolfishly. And this is one of the issues that I go into in the book, trying to work out if there is this dual meaning, which there isn't, but there's this association, I think, between wolves and the wearg because of this complex interplay of wolves as outcasts and outcasts as wolves.
Right. So there are associations between wolves and outlaws in that they're living outside, they're exiled, no one really wants to have them around. And this also comes up in places where you have outlaws being wolf's heads. I think in the gallows, I think you were talking about like wolf's head tree type thing. So tell us about how these things work together, because I think wolf's head, for example, is something that's very confused over time when people talk about it. They'll call an outlaw a wolf's head. What did you discover when you were looking at these things together?
Yeah, so there is, I think it's a 12th century law that purports to be from an earlier time, but there's kind of not much evidence that it actually was, in the context of the Normans trying to like legitimize their rule by saying, oh, our laws aren't our laws, we borrowed them from the Saxons that came before us. But in one of these 12th century laws, the outlaw is described as a wolf's head. So I think it's a person who breaks the peace of the church or something along those lines. And if he flees rather than facing up to his crime, he is then proclaimed a wolf's head because he has almost outcast himself by running away. There's no evidence that this term wolf's head did appear in Saxon laws. But having said that, in one of the Old English riddles, there's a compound word that kind of translates to wolf's head tree, which seems to be referring to the gallows. So there's this kind of hint that possibly there is this association between the wolf's head and the outlaw. But I mean, whether we've lost texts that would have shed more light on that or not, I don't know. But yeah, certainly there are these really tantalizing hints of this relationship between the wolf and the wolf's head and the outcast.
So we see in language then places where being a wolf is a bad thing, but then we also see it where it's being a good thing. So where do you see moments where people are described as wolves and it's not an insult?
Yeah, so particularly in pre-Christian contexts, because by the time you get this association with the devil and the wolf, it's like never a good thing to be called a wolf. But previous to that, in these, quote, pagan societies, being wolf-like, particularly if you are a warrior, isn't a bad thing, because you're channeling kind of an inner wolf, an inner wolfishness to defeat your enemies in battle. So that comes along with positive associations like being ferocious or being loyal. There's a wolfish equivalent of the Old Norse berserker, where we get the phrase going berserk from. So if you go berserk, you are filled with this battle rage. And it's thought that these warriors called berserkers wore bearskins into battle, and they kind of embodied the bear's ferocity, the bear's strength, all of that kind of stuff. And there's this equivalent, the Ulf Hethnar, and my pronunciation is probably terrible. But yeah, they are kind of this equivalent in that they wear wolf skins. So they're very deliberately using that image of the wolf and channeling that inner wolf. And also, if you're a warrior who creates lots of corpses, that's a positive thing because they feed wolves. So if you are a feeder of wolves, that means you're a really, really great warrior. So in terms of that, yeah, the wolf is absolutely seen in a positive light, as long as it's within that kind of battle context, because even in Old Norse poetry, you still have this idea of a wolf as an outcast. So it's all about, you can be wolfish, but if you use it for the right ends.
I mean, that's so true about so many animal images from the Middle Ages, isn't it? So when we think about wolves and we think about Old English, there's only one place to go. I mean, you have so many other things in the book, but in the interest of time, there's only one place to go. And of course, that is Beowulf. So the more you dug into wolves in Beowulf, well, the deeper you got, the more interesting it got. So tell us about looking into Beowulf from this perspective. What did you see?
Yeah, so Beowulf is a really interesting one because there's this online joke where people say, oh, there's no wolves in Beowulf, which is true. But in Beowulf, we have the hero Beowulf and we have the monsters, which are Grendel and Grendel's mother. And they live in a mere that is described as being surrounded by wolf slopes. So there's that landscape association with wolves that they live in. Also, Grendel's mother is referred to as a sea wolf, and both of them are referred to with that kind of contentious word wearg that may have that wolfish association. So you have these hints of wolfish. I'm not saying that the Grendelkin are actually wolves, but they're perceived or described as being sort of wolf-like. And then on the other hand, you have Beowulf, who embodies everything that is good about wolves. So he's loyal, he's a good leader, he's really strong, and he uses that wolfishness to defeat the Grendelkin. So he almost goes into that berserker-like, wolf-like state of mind, but he's using it for a good thing because he's saving a community from these monsters that are depredating on them. A kind of added layer of complexity was that I was reading the poem through the lens of both the wolf as outlaws. So the Grendelkin are these wolfish outlaws, not just as monsters that are kind of outlawed from humanity as a whole because they're said to be descended from Cain, but they've become monstrous because of that. So they're outcasts from humanity, and they're also outcasts from God because they're associated with the devil. So there's that kind of lens. And there's also the lens of the Grendlekin as speech stealers, as this wolfish speech stealer, because they sneak, like you were saying, wolves are sneaky. They sneak into the hall at Heorot every night and they kill different people. And it gets to the point where so many people have been killed, they've been silenced, that the community as a whole has stopped singing songs and has stopped celebrating as they usually would in this communal activity in the hall. So I argue in the book that perhaps the poet is drawing on this association of wolves as speech dealers, and then Beowulf himself has to come in as a wolf and steal the speech of the Grendlekin. It's kind of a complicated thing, and I think that's one of the wonderful things about Beowulf as a poem and why it's generated so many ideas and so much scholarship, is that it's got so many things. It's such a complicated poem, not just because it's long, but because it's influenced by so many different traditions and different ideas and everything. And yeah, I like to think that the poet was influenced by all of this wolf lore that had come from such different places, but had brought it together to make this one fantastic poem.
Yes. Well, it's got so many good kennings in it as well, which is one of the things that I love about it. So kennings being people combining words to make a new word, a good one, like a sea wolf to describe Grendel's mother, for example. And you jump right in there because Beowulf's name means like the wolf of the bees. And you're like, is this about bears or wolves? You went there. So what makes you think that this might be more about wolves than bears?
That's a good question. So yeah, the traditional or most widely accepted interpretation of Beowulf's name is that it's a kenning of two elements. So Beo meaning bee and wolf meaning wolf. So the kenning put together is wolf of the bees, which is then interpreted as meaning bear. I think that is certainly a valid interpretation, but based on kind of all of the wolf lore that seems to have influenced the poet, and particularly there is an Old Norse poem about Sigmund, and it's generally thought that the poet knew about this story of Sigmund because Beowulf is compared to Sigmund in the poem. And in this story, Sigmund's brothers are captured by an enemy king and they're locked in some stocks, and then each night a female werewolf comes and kills each of them. His sister finally comes up with a way to save Sigmund, and she brings some honey, which she smears onto Sigmund's mouth, so that when the wolf comes that night, he's the final brother left, the wolf comes, and instead of immediately devouring him, she starts licking the honey off his face. So it's been suggested that that is kind of a reason behind this Beowulf name. And I think it's a valid interpretation.
Well, I mean, I did put you on the spot there because this is a poem that has so much, not controversy necessarily, although there's that as well, but so much discussion about what everything means in it. And I think it's fair to keep having these discussions because it seems as if the poet definitely thought very carefully about all of the elements in there, including the name of the hero. And of course, we can't even tell if this is his invention or not. So I'm not asking you, definitely not asking you to solve this in one podcast episode, but we are coming to the end of our time. So having looked at wolves and Old English poetry and all the places that they appear, what would you like people to think about when they encounter wolves, when they're looking at any medieval literature, but especially the stuff from England? What is something that you'd like people to look for or look at when they see wolves appearing?
I think I would encourage people to not look at wolves as these one-dimensional, stereotypical, bloodthirsty, ravenous beasts. Because, you know, there is literature that frames them in that way, but there is also literature that frames them in a positive way or in a more ambivalent way, or even, I think, from my perspective, in a sympathetic way. I think there were definitely people in early medieval England who, just as today, you know, wolves are such a divisive animal. Some people love them, some people hate them. And I think it's reductive to say that, oh, everybody in medieval England hated wolves because they were a threat to their livelihoods or whatever. I think there were certainly people, they were perhaps not in the majority, but I think there were definitely people who were more sympathetic to the plight of wolves because they're this animal that is so heavily persecuted. And just as it's reductive to say that all wolves are bloodthirsty creatures, I think it's reductive to say that all people in early medieval England had the same reaction to wolves. I think it's definitely not out with the realms of possibility that somebody might see a dead wolf that had been hunted or trapped and feel sorrow for that animal, particularly before Christianity really, really takes hold. So yeah, I think that's one thing to really bear in mind, that it's a very complex issue, and it's not just one of wolves are bad, wolves are evil, wolves are the devil. It's much more nuanced than we necessarily often give the writers of these texts credit for.
I think that is a great way to put it. We need to give the writers more credit because they knew what they were doing as they were writing. I think that you said it all in that one sentence. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being here and telling us all about wolves in Old English literature. Thank you.
Thank you.
To find out more about Elizabeth's work, you can visit her website at wordsonwolves.co.uk. The book we discussed today is Wolves in Beowulf and Other Old English Texts. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. So, some academic research that I've been waiting for over 40 years has just come out.
40 years.
I'm very excited about it. I made sure it went up on medievalist.net. Basically, writing in the latest volume of Studies in Medievalism, Scott Manning is examining how the Arthurian legend got recreated in the 1984 film Transformers the Movie.
Oh my gosh, this is what you've been waiting for 40 years.
Indeed. I think this is a stunning piece of work. So the concept is, it was kind of really deliberately put out there by the scriptwriter of the movie, David Friedman. And it has the young Autobot Hot Rod having his own Arthurian moment when he claims the matrix of leadership. It's truly profound.
Well, I'm just laughing because I think what people don't know about you is that you go to YouTube and watch episodes about episodes of Transformers. Like, you are a super fan, and that's why I'm laughing about it.
I have a small collection. The Transformers came out at the very right time for me in the mid-'80s, a crucial moment in my upbringing. So I think it's very important that all medievalists know about this.
Okay, so people will have to go and check it out. The crucial link between Transformers and King Arthur.
Indeed, it's more than meets the eye.
Yes, I'm sure.
So we have that, plus we have Zoe Siami on how baptism shaped identity in medieval Europe. And Steve Tibble has another piece, this one on the Templars and Assassins having a pretty toxic landlord-tenant relationship in Lebanon.
There you go. For all the people who are interested in learning about toxic landlords from back in the day, Steve's got us covered.
Indeed. So all that and much, much more on medievalist.net.
Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and letting us know.
Thanks.
It's Canadian Thanksgiving this weekend, so it's my pleasure to take a moment to express my deep gratitude to all of you for being here each week, supporting independent history, and yours truly. Whether you're sharing your favorite episodes, letting the ads play, or becoming patrons on Patreon, you are very appreciated because it's all the little things you do that makes this work possible. To find out more or to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Old English wolves to werewolves, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is by Christian Overton. Thanks for listening and have yourself an amazing day.